June 1986. Super talented basketball player Leonard Kevin Len Bias had just been drafted second overall in the NBA draft, a phenomenal achievement for a kid from Washington's slums. Just 2 days later, he was preparing to sign a $2 million contract with Reebok. That same evening, he headed to a party with his team. The celebration lasted until morning. At 6:32 a.m., in the middle of a conversation with a teammate, he suffered a heart attack. 2 hours later, doctors would determine the cause of death: arrhythmia triggered by a cocaine overdose. In basketball, the use of white powder had long been overlooked, but estimates today suggest that 3/4 of NBA players in the 1980s used cocaine before games. Michael Jordan himself described it in the documentary The Last Dance. I walk into the hotel room and see my entire team. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. Cocaine lines everywhere. In the 1980s, an epidemic of this drug swept across the United States. Surveys show that 1 in 10 Americans had tried it, 2 million couldn't live without it, and traces of the powder were found on nearly 80% of all cash in circulation. Cocaine had become a symbol of the affluent lifestyle in the West, like today's latest MacBook or Tesla. In just 10 years, it became an inseparable part of leisure for wealthy Americans, from businessmen to professional athletes. But Len Bias's death would forever change America's relationship with cocaine. Conservative President Ronald Reagan would continue Nixon's legacy, declaring an all-out war on drugs, the most massive state campaign against narcotics in the country's history. President George H.W. Bush would hold live broadcasts with a bag of cocaine in hand, while then Senator Joe Biden would lobby for this operation for nearly 30 years. During the war on drugs, hundreds would be killed, tens of thousands imprisoned, and $1 trillion spent. Yet no one could have imagined that the death of a young basketball star would lead to the fall of Pablo Escobar's empire, the legendary drug lord with a fortune in the hundreds of billions. Today, everyone's heard of Pablo. He's become a cult figure, inspiring dozens of films and series. The most popular, Narcos, is one of Netflix's biggest hits. Nearly 30 million people watched the 3rd season in its first week alone. Its staggering success reignited the question: who was Pablo Escobar? A bloodthirsty drug baron or a modern Robin Hood, a fighter for justice? Online, there are countless tales of Escobar's astronomical wealth, but few try to unpack how this man, looking like a chubby guy in a funny fur hat in this photo, became one of the most influential people in the world. This episode, as you've likely guessed, isn't about basketball or even cocaine's devastating effects on the nervous system. This video is about business and politics rooted in drug trafficking. In this installment, I'll reveal how Pablo Escobar reinvented the Robin Hood image, becoming a phenomenon of pop culture. I'll show how his infamous cartel operated, analyze the business model of Escobar's main product, from jungle labs in Colombia to nightclub bathrooms in Miami. And by the end, you'll learn how Escobar transformed from the people's darling into public enemy number one. Pablo was born in 1949 in a small village near Medellin, Colombia. He was the 7th child in a family marked by hunger and poverty. But it wasn't just about being born into a poor family. It was about the country's misfortune. We won't dive too deeply into his biography now, but understanding the context of the environment where Escobar grew up and what influenced him is crucial. Throughout the 20th century, Colombia was consumed by civil wars. A year before Pablo's birth, La Violencia erupted, a war between the government, political parties, and criminal groups. It's remembered for the torture and brutal massacres carried out by all sides in the conflict. Even now, over half a century later, the civil conflict hasn't fully ended. From 1948 to 1958, the war claimed 200,000 lives. To put it in perspective, the U.S. lost 50,000 soldiers in Vietnam over 20 years. Crisis, inflation, and poverty against a backdrop of political instability all fueled the growth of the shadow economy. The drug trade became a cornerstone, no longer dominated by small gangs, but by organized groups with clear structures and vast resources. Over time, they became capable of rivaling major agricultural companies and even the state itself. For many farmers, growing marijuana and coca was far more profitable than traditional crops. This all unfolded against a backdrop of rampant anti-Americanism. Leftist ideas were popular among the poorest segments of society, with all troubles blamed on damned capitalists from the North. To be fair, the U.S. did actively interfere in Colombia's internal affairs. The 19th century Monroe Doctrine evolved into a big stick policy in the early 20th century, when Theodore Roosevelt declared Latin America a zone of direct U.S. influence, where America could act not just diplomatically, but militarily. By the mid-20th century, as you know, the Cold War was raging, and the U.S. didn't want another communist Cuba emerging nearby. So the United States used various methods to influence Colombia, funding criminal clans, terrorizing local communists in government and underground, while officially denying any involvement. For countries like Colombia, there's a specific term, failed state. This describes a situation where the government lacks a monopoly on violence, parts of the country are ungoverned, and certain social groups are cut off from money and social institutions. This is the country where Pablo Escobar was born and raised. So it's hardly surprising that Escobar's first earnings as a teenager were tied to crime. At 16, he dropped out of school and built a business stealing and reselling gravestones. Later, he switched gears, moving into car theft and extortion. At 23, while many of you were carefree, not thinking about mortgages or even starting a career, Escobar kidnapped a wealthy local industrialist, Diego Echeverria, tortured him for days, and then killed him. And Pablo openly boasted that he was behind the kidnapping and murder. Yet the official investigation went nowhere. Tellingly, Echeverria's death thrilled the slum dwellers. Perhaps that's when Escobar first felt the intoxicating mix of total impunity and widespread public support. A year later, his life would change dramatically. In the 1970s, demand for a relatively new drug, cocaine, began to rise in the United States. For a long time, it was considered elite, affordable only to successful, wealthy individuals. But interest in cocaine was growing, while the attention of police and the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, was fixated solely on marijuana. By this point, Escobar was already involved in smuggling, but not drugs. He trafficked coffee and cigarettes. However, once he learned how much people in California, Florida, and New York were willing to pay for cocaine, Pablo realized this was the product that would take him to the next level. By then, Pablo was already a multimillionaire and one of Colombia's wealthiest criminals. He enjoyed the support of the poorest segments of society, commanding hundreds of mercenaries. He had begun building his base of social support, a necessity for running an illegal but highly people-dependent business. In Colombia's provinces, he was known as a generous patron, helping the slum dwellers of Medellin, especially children. So he entered the drug trade well prepared. What was Pablo's criminal scheme? At first, Escobar simply transported coca paste from Peru and Bolivia. Coca wasn't widely grown in Colombia at the time. The paste was then processed and shipped to the U.S. Pablo's role in the chain was minimal. He was just a middleman. Seeing the enormous sums flowing through this business, Escobar understood he needed to control the entire supply chain: cultivation, harvesting, transportation, and processing. For processing raw materials, he built, bought, and seized laboratories deep in the Colombian jungles. Miniature towns, in essence. Don't confuse them with the high-tech labs from Breaking Bad. The scale was different. Coca leaves could be ground underfoot by children, and the product was heated in old gasoline barrels. No water, no electricity, jungles are jungles. No one had ever run criminal operations on this scale before. In modern terms, Pablo was a visionary. He foresaw that cocaine would see massive demand in the coming years. Contrary to myths, Pablo wasn't the first to smuggle drugs into the U.S., but he convinced his associates to pivot from marijuana, which was already profitable, to cocaine. Another of Pablo's innovations was transporting finished cocaine. Previously, the powder reached the U.S. in modest amounts, hidden in suitcases with false bottoms or swallowed in condoms by mules. He revolutionized this archaic system. Today, most drug trafficking into the U.S. goes through Mexico, but in the 1970s, cocaine arrived by air and sea. What did the main route look like? Private planes were loaded in Colombia, then flew to Caribbean islands, and from there, biplanes carried cocaine to Miami. Criminals learned to evade U.S. radars. Planes landed on highways or dirt roads, even in Everglades National Park. The government periodically tried to interfere, but Pablo was always one step ahead. No land for a runway. Buy an entire island. Locals on nearby islands complain? Send in an army of mercenaries. U.S. authorities detect your main route. Launch a new one. Escobar's most ingenious innovation was liquid cocaine. Ordinary jeans were soaked in cocaine mixed with water, then legally imported. Buyers would later wash the jeans with a special solution, steaming the cocaine back into powder. But the key method for delivering drugs to the U.S. remained airplanes, used also to smuggle back millions in cash. At its peak, things got so extreme that cocaine was dropped from planes, then sunk in the ocean, while pilots parachuted to safety. Think about it. A biplane cost $10,000 to $20,000, but the cargo on board was worth tens of millions. Such production costs were negligible. To grasp the scale, one of Escobar's former pilots recalled earning $2.5 million for an 8-hour flight.
And I asked them how much they paid, and they paid $5,000 a kilo to haul it. And so I said, how much you put on the plane? He said, $300, $500. So that's $2.5 million for an 8-hour trip. Sounded pretty good to me.
But time passed, and as the business expanded, scaling operations inevitably became more complex. To boost margins, more people and connections were needed. No one could run such a juggernaut alone, especially with competitors nipping at their heels. This pushed Escobar and other influential drug lords to negotiate, marking the beginning of the Medellin Cartel, which would become a state within a state. In 1977, just before the cocaine boom hit the West, Colombia's top drug traffickers met around a table at the Ochoa Brothers Ranch. The result was an organization called the Medellin Cartel. Strictly speaking, from an economic perspective, it's more accurate to call it a syndicate, not a cartel, since members were forbidden from independently selling their product. Why was this necessary? The drug traffickers acted with cold rationality. The market was vast. There was room for everyone, and fighting among themselves was costly and complicated, especially with the Cali cartel, which resented new players. Pooling resources proved mutually beneficial. Higher turnover, more money, a bigger market. But most importantly, the cartel massively boosted overall profits. In a competitive market, individual players might undercut cocaine prices, but by uniting, they could set any price they wanted. Consumers had no choice but to pay. With cocaine, no regulatory bodies threatened the drug lords, and if anyone dared to speak up, their days were numbered. Producing 1 gram of cocaine cost about $1. On Colombia's streets, it sold for $5 to $10. With the cartel's formation, the retail price in the U.S. skyrocketed to $700 per gram, a price the Medellin cartel centrally set. But how was the cartel structured internally? The idea of unification didn't come from Escobar, but from the Ochoa brothers. Previously, they trafficked marijuana in Miami, building logistics and strong connections. And unlike their cartel partners, they weren't brutal thugs. They were known for their diplomacy and foresight, the true brains of the operation. The brothers handled financial planning and logistics for shipments. The muscle was managed by Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, nicknamed the Mexican, who commanded a private army of professional fighters trained by British and Israeli mercenaries. Gacha handled the physical elimination of the cartel's enemies, police, judges, officials, and rival drug lords. But a mercenary army wasn't enough to secure a business with billions in turnover. That's where the sicarios, hired assassins from the slums, came in. Don't think of them as professional hitmen. They were mostly kids, teenage boys, recruited from Medellin's poorest neighborhoods. Not out of choice, but desperation. The cartel lured young criminals with money and respect, offering a social ladder as an alternative to poverty and humiliation by the state. As one former sicario put it, "We were ready to die robbing a bank. Pablo gave us the chance to die declaring war on the state." Their signature tool was the motorcycle. One rode, the other wielded a weapon from the back seat. It was a fast, effective killing method that bandits across South America adopted. Sicarios worked for the cartel, handling everything from contract killings to managing domestic drug distribution. They were everywhere in Colombia but isolated from the cartel's leadership. Even if authorities caught someone, they couldn't trace the top bosses. Sometimes Escobar personally held training sessions for sicarios. This archival footage shows him riding around his estate with top mercenaries, teaching aggressive motorcycle handling. How much did these hitmen earn? On average, a police officer's life was worth about $100. Lesser-known politicians went for around $1,000. A DEA agent's life fetched $5,000. For influential judges or politicians, the price was negotiated separately. So a simple drug smuggling pilot earned $2.5 million for an 8-hour flight, while killing a state representative like a police officer only paid a measly $100. It says a lot about the value of human life in Colombia at the time. A significant portion of the cartel's market depended on the United States, a matter of simple geography. That's why Europe wasn't of interest. It was too far, with high costs and few connections. The cartel's distribution operated like a franchise or, more accurately, a network marketing scheme. All profits flowed back to the cartel, while local operatives lived off a percentage. Escobar and his partners built a network of distributors and retailers, from organized crime groups in the US to drug lords in small Colombian migrant towns. Working for Pablo was lucrative. As a monopolist, he could jack up prices as high as he wanted. The product would still sell. And if anyone objected, they could be bribed or threatened with violence. Escobar's fortune is estimated at around $30 billion, about $100 billion in today's terms. At the peak of the cartel's power, Pablo ranked 7th among the world's richest people and even proposed paying off Colombia's entire national debt. But pinning down his exact wealth is impossible. Open financial reporting is laughable in this context. Still, it's widely known he spent $5,000 a month just on rubber bands for cash bundles. Today, when we talk about ultra-wealthy figures, you often hear that while Elon Musk's net worth is in the hundreds of billions, he doesn't have that much cash on hand. It's just the value of his company's assets. With Pablo, it was the opposite. He had so much cash that it had to be buried in the ground. His brother once wrote that about 10% of their profits were written off because rats ate them, roughly $2 billion a year. Legends still circulate that, during Colombia's rainy seasons, anyone might stumble upon Pablo's millions in washed-out earth. The dirty cash needed laundering, and dozens of specialists worked on this daily, including many of Pablo's relatives. The money laundering scheme was deceptively simple. The cartel opened hundreds of businesses across America, pumping millions in cash into them. Pablo's business empire included consulting firms, charter airlines, taxi fleets, jewelry stores, and even mines. Classic schemes also involved buying luxury items, paintings by Dalí and Picasso, which Pablo later hung in his prison cell. But the simplest laundering method was not laundering at all. The president of Panama, who loved cash as much as Pablo, allowed cocaine money to be stored in local banks. Imagine being Pablo's accountant. You've just bought expensive art, exchanged millions in currency, and a week later, you're laundering another $400 million, and then more and more and more. In just a few years, the Medellín Cartel captured 80% of the U.S. cocaine market. But for Pablo Escobar, even that wasn't enough. If you watch any interview with people who worked with Pablo, they'll all say the same thing, as if reading from a script. He was humble and honest. That's what the cartel's top hitman said, as well as those lower on the totem pole. They called Escobar the true Colombian godfather, or more accurately, a Robin Hood. With the support he'd secured in his native Medellin, Escobar genuinely began to believe in himself as a politician. Was it childhood dreams of becoming president, or did he simply crave the international immunity that public office could provide? Starting in 1979, the drug lord actively worked on crafting his public image. The money from drug sales didn't just fund endless palaces and rat dinners, it also went into charity, instantly earning him a people's cashback. His first public project was Civismo en Marcha, Citizenship in Motion. Escobar planted trees, invested in sports, and opened hospitals for low-income people. Naturally, there was his own newspaper, which colorfully covered it all, though of course it never mentioned where the money came from. His most famous social program was Medellin without slums. Thousands of homes were built in the city's poorest neighborhoods. And to provide not just bread but circuses, Pablo became the sponsor of the local soccer club, Atlético Nacional. The Pablo Escobar Quarter, as locals call it, still stands today. Medellin's poorest residents were ecstatic. For them, Pablo was one of their own, a guy who made it big. It's fascinating to examine Escobar's political views. From a political science perspective, he had no clear ideological platform. He wasn't left-wing, right-wing, conservative, or liberal. He was a businessman, if you can call his line of work that, who tried to break into power. What kind of system of beliefs can you attribute to someone whose key political demand was repeal the extradition agreement with the US? Here's why. At home, Colombian drug lords felt untouchable. The threat of local prison didn't scare them. They were confident nothing would happen. Everything could be settled with money and, if needed, threats. But the US was increasingly turning its gaze toward Colombia, trying to stem the cocaine flood. They began pressuring Colombia's leadership to extradite the drug traffickers they wanted. This deeply worried Escobar. He argued that extraditing Colombians to America undermined national sovereignty. The rest of his ideology boiled down to pure populism, bribery, and criticism of the elite. Despite being one of the richest people on earth, he somehow positioned himself as separate from them. His sole goal was expanding his business empire while buying votes and throwing charity as a bonus. The Robin Hood image Pablo constructed sold incredibly well. By the late 1980s, Colombia's poorest adored him, and they still do today. You can find countless YouTube videos titled Business Tips from Pablo Escobar. References and tributes to Pablo have become a staple of rap culture. Few haven't compared themselves to Escobar. Pop culture has framed him as a self-made drug lord, but above all, a Robin Hood, though he was a butcher up to his elbows, shoulders, neck, and crown in blood. No romantic paintings of a chubby man with bullets, created by modern artists, can change that. Somehow everyone forgets that Pablo Escobar was a terrorist who ordered mass killings and terrorized his own people with those attacks. It's reliably known he was responsible for at least 6,500 deaths, a figure cited by his trusted hitman. Escobar's harshest critics claim up to 100,000 people died by his hand. From the start, Pablo's business empire was built on the principle of plata o plomo, silver or lead. Sure, you could take an entirely amoral stance and argue that killing mercenaries or rivals was just a cost of building a drug cartel. But what he did in the late 1980s can only be called terrorism. The trouble began right after he was elected to Congress. There he faced widespread public backlash for the first time, a reaction he wasn't used to. In Medellin, over half of all politicians were on the cartel's payroll. The poorest citizens hung on his every word. But in other parts of Colombia, Escobar was seen for what he was, a criminal who bought his way into power with drug money. Soon his reputation took a crushing blow. Colombia's justice minister publicly presented evidence that Escobar's election campaign was funded by cocaine profits. Pablo was convinced the minister's speech was bankrolled by the Cali cartel, which was gaining momentum and seriously rivaling the Medellin cartel. At first, he tried to fight back with a PR campaign, but to no avail. He was expelled from Congress in disgrace, and his U.S. visa was revoked. After that, Escobar snapped. He declared all-out war on the Colombian government and its people. Those years would be known as the era of narco-terrorism. The first victim was that very minister, gunned down in a taxi. Then sicarios started planting bombs and openly targeting members of the Cali cartel. At this time, the Medellin cartel underwent a rebrand, becoming Los Extraditables, or literally, the extraditables. In response, authorities issued arrest warrants for Pablo and his inner circle. A special task force was formed, an elite unit of top police and intelligence agents with one goal: capturing Pablo Escobar. Meanwhile, the president dared to sign a bill allowing the extradition of criminals to the U.S., the very measure Escobar had long opposed. By the mid-1980s, America woke up and launched a real fight against Escobar's narco empire. For a decade, Washington had turned a blind eye to cocaine. They were more concerned with communists, Afghanistan, and marijuana. Escobar and his family could freely visit the U.S., posing for photos in front of the White House, attending Mike Tyson fights, going to Disneyland, and spending millions in Las Vegas. The story of a potential NBA star dying of an overdose became the trigger. After Len Bias's death, the U.S. began aggressively combating cocaine trafficking at home and abroad. That's when Escobar was doomed. He found himself fighting on three fronts: against the government, the Cali Cartel, and leftist radicals. Over 5 years of this terrorist campaign, Escobar's actions claimed the lives of 3 Colombian presidential candidates, the Attorney General, dozens of judges, and over 1,000 police officers. In 1988, the Cali Cartel attempted to assassinate Pablo's family, detonating 800 kilograms of TNT outside his mansion. Several of Pablo's bodyguards died, and his daughter was left permanently deaf. His son and wife miraculously survived, but after feeling utterly vulnerable, Escobar's transformation from drug lord to ruthless terrorist was complete. Within a month, over 200 explosions rocked Colombian cities. Hundreds died. People recall how, in those years, simply stepping out to the store felt terrifying. A year later, Escobar's men bombed a Colombian airliner, killing over 100 passengers in the attack. The cartel suffered losses too. More and more of Pablo's associates were extradited to the U.S. Eventually, Escobar agreed to a deal with the government. The terms were simple. He'd surrender to authorities, but they'd stop pursuing his allies and not extradite him to the U.S. There was a catch, though. Pablo would only serve time in a prison built exclusively for him. And believe it or not, after all those terrorist attacks, the downed plane, and thousands of victims, the authorities still caved. On 3 hectares, they built a mansion with a pool and cinema, paid for by Pablo himself. It was a small fortress they had to guard. Now Escobar could relax, safe from attacks by the cartel. He didn't have to worry about CIA agents either. They were banned from approaching within 5 kilometers of the building. Serving this absurd sentence, Pablo once again believed in his own significance. From prison, he began slowly rebuilding his empire, punishing traitors who exploited his absence to avoid payments or steal merchandise. Some enemies were brought directly to the prison and killed there. Word of this soon reached Colombian authorities, and even their patience snapped. The president ordered Escobar transferred to a regular prison, but as always, Pablo stayed one step ahead. At the last moment, the drug lord escaped, responding to the government's move with a new wave of explosions. For over a year, Escobar lived on the run, unable to see his family. The CIA, the government, cartels, and leftist combatants tracked his every move. But on December 2nd, 1993, the day after his birthday, Pablo was spotted in Medellin. Within a minute, police stormed the house. Escobar tried to flee to the roof, but a sniper was waiting. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was dead. Escobar's death wasn't without conspiracy theories. At least that's what his son believes. He recalls his father telling him from childhood to keep his boots by the bed, claiming they were far better for shaking off pursuers than any weapon. Yet on the roof in Medellin before his death, Escobar was completely barefoot. Moreover, his son believes Pablo would never have surrendered to authorities, and if cornered, was prepared to take his own life. But this version clashes with the testimony of nearly 15 people involved in Escobar's capture. After the death of the cocaine kingpin, the drug trade in Colombia didn't diminish. On the contrary, a vacuum formed, quickly filled by the Cali Cartel. That is, until they too were caught and taken down. But the murder rate plummeted. During the height of the terror, Medellin was the epicenter of global violence, with 300 people killed there in just a couple of days. After Pablo's death, murders dropped by 80%. Today, you can play paintball on the grounds of Escobar's prison, and his relatives lead tours through his mansion. Hidden stashes of Escobar's millions are still regularly found in his properties or on random farms during rains. But Colombia inherited more from Pablo than just a tourist boom, abandoned mansions, and at least 15,000 graves. It inherited an image it struggled to shake for 30 years. Popular series, songs, and legends portray Pablo as a successful businessman with Robin Hood tendencies. Narcos only reinforced this narrative, ostensibly balancing it by emphasizing that Escobar was, first and foremost, a terrorist who killed innocent people, those unlucky enough to share his country and era. By the same logic, Netflix could produce a series about bin Laden's family, a successful business empire, care for the poorest, and hundreds of terrorist attacks with thousands of victims. Best not to dwell on the latter. Escobar, like almost everyone, loved his family and protected his circle. But that doesn't excuse the evil he inflicted on everyone else. It's not just that drugs are bad. We won't stoop to critics' level and claim the series could somehow boost crime. But in the real story, the focus must be set right. Pablo was a drug lord who hooked millions on cocaine. Above all, he was a terrorist whose ideology was nothing but revenge. His product killed hundreds of thousands, and his bullets and bombs killed just as many. The Robin Hood image he so carefully constructed still overshadows his horrific crimes for many, even today. But those people would do well to understand that a man who loves his country doesn't declare war on it and unleash a bloodbath twice in a decade. If you found this interesting, subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends and acquaintances. A new video is already in the works. See you soon.